The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen.
Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Implementing Remote Clinical Trial Monitoring to Ensure Continuity of Trials and Data Preservation while Keeping Patients Safe. My name is Mira, and I'll be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Syneos, who developed the content for this presentation. Syneos Health is the only fully integrated biopharmaceutical solutions organization. The company, including a contract research organization and contract commercial organization, is purpose-built to accelerate customer performance to address modern market realities. We bring together approximately 2,400 clinical and commercial minds with the ability to support customers in more than 110 countries. Together, we share insights, use the latest technologies, and apply advanced business practices to speed up our customers' delivery of important therapies to patients. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Nicole Stansberry has 26 years of experience in the industry, beginning as a study coordinator at a multi-therapeutic site, followed by 21 years at a large global CRO, where she spent several years as a clinical research associate and project manager before moving into a leadership role, where she led development of risk-based monitoring strategy, process, and tools. Nicole has consulted with biotech companies on ICH E6R2 compliance, conducted risk management training, performed detailed assessments of EDC, CTMS, RBM, and eTMF technologies for a small CRO, and completed a risk management and centralized monitoring process assessment for a large pharmaceutical company. Jackie Hughes has 31 years of experience in the industry, starting her career as clinical data associate for a large pharmaceutical company where she worked for 25 years, undertaking numerous data management roles prior to moving into leadership positions. Jackie currently heads up the Global Data Operations Organization, consisting of over 700 data management and clinical programmers, supporting delivery of the full service portfolio across all therapeutic business units. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our speakers. They may begin when they are ready.
Hi there. My name is Nicole Stansberry, and I am happy to join you this morning to review our guidance on remote clinical trial monitoring. We recognize this has been a very just global challenging situation, and we have had numerous questions. I know there's been a lot of guidance in the industry, and we really want to focus on trying to glean some insights from the number of different guidances that have come out there. A lot of the what we'll be talking about today is centered around the ACRO guidance. So ACRO is the Association of Clinical Research Organizations, their guidance on supporting trials during the COVID-19 pandemic. MHRA and FDA have also produced a number of guidance documents. These are being updated on sometimes every 2 or 3 days with additional points or clarifications. And I know it's a very challenging time to try and navigate. And we're also learning as we go. We're finding that there are some unique situations where our first strategy or resolution it is not going to work, and we're having to adapt and flex on the fly. So hopefully this will help provide some insights into just some principles to keep in mind as we're trying to navigate this challenging time period. And I think if we can keep some general principles in mind as each of those individual new obstacles or challenges come our way, we can go back to those guiding principles and help those make help use those guiding principles to allow us to fine-tune our decisions for the unique circumstances we're facing on a daily basis. So I want to outline the key discussion topics, and these are primarily going to be based on the ACRO guidance. One of the questions will be around how this is impacting monitoring. We'll talk about what are some ways that monitoring can continue during this situation. We'll talk a little bit about what happens to studies that are nearing a database lock. We'll talk about what changes might need to be made or workflows reassessed related to EDC process and workflows. And then we'll look at start to think about what to do when the situation resolves. What are some things we can be preparing now to help us get to that point when we're in the recovery mode and reinitiation of activities. So the first thing that I want to do is to talk about, the scope of the situation right now. So we've got sites that have been suspended operations, or they've restricted all visitors, which include clinical research associates. We have local government and health officials have implemented regional quarantines. We have CRAs that may be not in a quarantine zone, but are unable to travel to sites, either for personal health reasons, perhaps, or due to travel restrictions in limiting their ability to get on site. Interestingly, we've also started to see sites with other challenges that impact monitoring. For example, we have sites whose personnel have been pulled into helping with COVID patients. We have had site personnel that are non-essential being told to work from home in order to alleviate the number of people that are actually in the office to preserve personal protective equipment. We have study coordinators who, some of them may have access via a laptop computer that they can take home with them to still access electronic health records or EDC. Others may not have that luxury. They may not have a laptop that they can come home and access electronic health records or EDC. And there are a few sites that are still working off of paper records and unable to get access to those paper records if they're quarantined within their home. So a number of different ways that COVID-19 is impacting monitoring in clinical trials and even our ability to communicate with sites on a consistent and regular basis. I'll advance the slide here. So what are some of the ways that monitoring can continue during this situation? One of the things that we want to keep in mind as one of those guiding principles, and this has been in every guidance from EMA, MHRA, FDA, and ACRO, and many pharma organizations that have produced their own guiding principles around this situation, is to make sure that whatever we do, we are considering the burden on the site, and we are still considering GDPR, data security, access risks to data, and those kinds of things. So primarily, we want to make sure that we're protecting the burden on the site and not introducing any more stress to a time where they're being called to do very heroic measures in a number of different ways. We also want to make sure that we're not recommending or requesting that sites fax source documentation for remote review. That has not been a good practice or principle for a number of years. It poses a number of different challenges, and having been a study coordinator Faxing or scanning source documents is very time consuming. It may involve having to take paper out of a chart, and then you don't have it collated again in the right order to get it back in a chart. It can be very time consuming. It can actually destroy the continuity of the chart and the data that the site has in their organization of that material to do the scanning and convey that information. So it can be a real challenge. So these are two guiding principles that we really want to focus on as we look at solutions without burdening the sites. So the first solution, and this is a solution that I think is supported by many both large and small pharma companies within the industry, as well as the ACRO RBM working group. And that is that we can still glean a lot of information by reviewing data directly into the EDC, lab portals, reports, listings. There are a number of ways we can look at data that has been collected without source documentation, and we can discuss those findings with site staff over the phone. So that's first and foremost, probably the most effective and efficient manner of maintaining some continuity of monitoring. We also want to make sure that any findings that we discover during the course of our review of this data are documented in a way that we would normally document findings if we were doing SDR and SDV on site. So we should still be issuing queries in EDC to document that trail of question and data change. We still want to document any issues or action items in CTMS and protocol deviations in either CTMS or EDC, whatever the process is for that particular trial. We also want to make sure that any of the calls with the sites where we're discussing topics around the status of the site and the status of the subjects are documented and discussed in the topics in IMV reports. Even if some of the content is not applicable or unable to be assessed, it's very clear from the regulators that detailed documentation around what we were and were not able to do, and some of the different workarounds or accommodations that are having to be made during this time are well documented. So it's really important that we're still looking at that data in EDC and still having those detailed communications with the sites where possible. We also want to make sure that when we are on the phone with the site that we're very much limiting their time. So any of the review that we can do, you don't want to do the review while you're on the phone with the site. The CRAs should be reviewing that data as a preparation for that call for the site, have a very clear, concise list of questions that they have in that data that need the immediate attention of the site staff. Otherwise, document your queries through EDC and allow that site the flexibility to respond to those queries in an appropriate manner, and use the time on the phone with them for the updates on the risk status of the site and the subjects. Which subjects are they still able to see? What do they need from us from a support mechanism? What procedures are they having a difficulty with, and where can we help them throughout this process? The second way that we can perform these reviews is using EHR if we have EHR access. Now, what we're recommending is that, if the sites have access or allow us to have access to their EHR remotely, we can perform that remote review of EHR to perform the SDR and the SDV. But one of the things we don't want to do is we don't want to get into a situation where either there are regulatory requirements, like most of the countries in Europe may not allow us to have remote access to EHR. If we are allowed to do it, that's great. But we need to understand that it's not as simple as that. There are questions around, maybe within the country, since the US allows EHR access, that's great, but the site may have policies in place that don't allow access to EHR. The site may not have a contract with their EHR vendor that allows them to grant access to other parties. So it's not as simple as, does your system allow it, or does the regulation in the country allow it? There are a lot more complexities around that, and to try and get the sites to navigate through that now in the midst of this pandemic, when there are so many other things those sites are facing right now, is a challenge. And if we can get by with performing the methodology of reviewing that data in EDC with outsource, that might be a better option at this point than trying to navigate those technical questions and those regulatory questions around how to get that access to EHR from a remote standpoint in this time period. If we already have that access and it's already set up, then that is fine. That is a great way to do it. But it's few and far between in many cases where sites actually have that capability and can navigate that during this particular time period. I think the other thing to do is that there are a lot of ways that we can increase existing central monitoring capabilities to supplement key risk indicators and dashboards and things like that. So whether it's listings reviews, maybe it is now is a good time to refresh those listings and start to do some increased listings reviews, for example, on the data if we don't have the ability to perform that source documentation the way that we would typically like. And I would say that now is maybe not the time to start trying to add all these technologies to your study either. For example, trying to go in and set up a central monitoring capability on a study now that would require builds of dashboards and other things. It may take several weeks, and by that period of time, the sites may be back up and running in some areas. So I think it's really important as we look at our solutions that we're being pragmatic, we're assessing our guiding principles around not increasing burden to site, and that we're not overreacting to the situation in a way that could jeopardize the outcome of the trial. We don't want to rush things and make rash decisions. We need to really be calm and look at what we have and see what we can do and focus on the things that are critical and that matter. I'll advance to the next slide. So what is the value? And I know that there's probably a lot of questions around what truly can the value be of performing that EDC review without source documentation. And I think there's still a tremendous amount of value there. If you think about it, the regulatory authorities review data that are submitted for the trial, and they aren't looking at source data when they pick up on inconsistencies in the data. They are performing a risk assessment of what they're looking at when they look at the data. We need to be doing the same thing. When our data management team or our biostatisticians or our medics find issues within the data during their remote reviews, there is a lot of information that can be found, and we need to take the time and make sure that we're reviewing that data now in the same ways that we're used to people who don't have access to that source reviewing the data. So we can find a lot of things like eligibility violations just by looking at what is in the medical history, in the scales and the EPROs, the diaries, the physical exams, and the concomitant medications. We can find non-compliances with the protocol in the data. Now, especially, we'll be able to monitor very closely what activities might be missed and what protocol deviations are being caused by the COVID outbreak. For example, visits that were outside of visit windows, gaps in investigational product administration, dose tapers or titrations that weren't able to occur, SAE reporting, adherence to withdrawal criteria. All of those things we can observe and see and have discussions with sites about during the course of this pandemic without looking at source and helping to guide those sites and navigate through the situation to ensure patient safety and the integrity of the data as much as possible. And from a safety perspective, there are a lot of things that we can do. We can look at the AEs, for example, that have been reported or the lack thereof. So if we go into an EDC system and I can see that the subject has had 9 visits, but the last adverse event was reported, 14 months ago, that tells me that there's likely some underreporting or some missed documentation of adverse events in the EDC system. So I can go ahead and ask that question and query that information in the database. I can still look for adverse events that have been documented in EDC that technically should have probably been captured as an SAE, but they haven't been reported. So I can question those. I can look at the logic checks between AEs and ConMed and AEs and medical history. So there are a lot of those things that can still occur. We can escalate those as needed to the medical monitor or the principal investigator as needed. So a lot of activity can still happen, very beneficial, being that extra set of eyes and ears for the sites at this point. I think the other thing we have to recognize is that right now, the sites are very distracted with all of the disruptions. And so anything that we can do in looking at that data and being that extra set of eyes and ears, point out to them perhaps that, hey, we were looking in the lab portal and we see that the lab from last week for this patient was significantly abnormal. Are you worried about that? Did you notice that? In the midst of all that's going on, they might like a nice reminder that there was this abnormal lab that they needed to follow up on for this patient and prioritize that in the grand scheme of things with everything else that they're looking at from a patient safety perspective. So I want to just share with you a few items that allow you to kind of see what some of the things are that we can do in reviewing data in our various systems without source. And I will tell you that about it in this particular example, a lot of this data was already monitored, 100% SDR and STV. And when we reviewed this data after that, by looking at data in a different way in systems, we were able to find some additional things. So my point here is that I understand the value of what might be in the source that doesn't make its way into the EDC system, but there is a lot of information that we can glean just by looking at that data in EDC or through listings or other things that can help keep this data clean, the validation of the data secure, and the patient safety. So in this example, we found eligibility criteria that was not met. Questions around dosing and compliance with concomitant medication use. Lab findings that needed to be followed up on. Additional protocol violations and some inconsistencies in vital sign measurements. Should these have actually been recorded as adverse events? We're able to look, the other thing that you can do at this time in looking at the data is look at the data with a big picture perspective. So the study level reviews, and this is where looking at data from a listings perspective may come into play. Just as an example, we could look at e-diary compliance, for example, and say what percentage of the patient data on this trial is missing from an e-diary standpoint. We can look at data logic. We can, again, confirm eligibility criteria. And there are some ways to even find transcription errors in looking at data on a large scale, as well as managing and monitoring dosing compliance. I think the study level reviews now that can be performed during this time period are really important for the decisions that our sponsors are needing to make as they're looking at the next steps with when we're in the recovery mode. So for example, if we're paying attention to how many subject visits are actually being missed right now, let's count those. Let's keep track of that data. How many subject visits are able to be completed, but where a primary endpoint for efficacy or safety has not been able to be performed. If there are visits that are being performed, but they're being performed out of window, how far out of window are they? Starting to look at data this way and assessing this type of information is going to, and bringing that back together to the study team is really going to give the sponsors some information about what actions that they need to take once we're in recovery mode. Am I going to need to reopen enrollment because we have invaluable patients now because they missed data collection for too long of a period of time, according to our statisticians? Or do we need to amend the protocol to add 4 more data collection points, at the end of the study for each patient in order to recover some of the data that we need? So those are some of the things that we want to try and look at now, even without source documentation, to really be able to help stay on top of the validity of the data and the safety of the patients. So did I skip 2 slides? Nope, I did not. I did that correctly. Okay, so what about studies nearing database lock? This is a question that we've been getting quite a bit. And the ACRO position is that it is not necessary to ensure 100% SDR and SDV of all subject visits and data prior to locking a database. I think that it's not only the ACRO position, but FDA and other regulatory authorities support a reduced SDR and SDV strategy. It may mean that we need to document that new strategy as an addendum to your monitoring plan during this COVID-19 period. But I think it's important to make sure that we're doing a risk assessment. And so the way to do that would be to look at what percentage of the critical data has already been SDR'd and SDV'd. So what is our gap? So that's the first question we need to ask. Then we need to look at, of the data that has been unmonitored, what is it? How many critical data points, primary or efficacy or safety endpoints are included in that data that have been unmonitored? Of the data that's unmonitored, how likely is it that there are significant errors in that data that would have to be adjusted or amended in order for it to be included in the analysis? And so for that, you can go back and look at previous queries on other patients' data or other patients at that site to see, have there been issues before in this data at the site? If there is, perhaps you can have a phone call with the site and you can ask them to even read you what is in the medical record for that particular data point while the CRA is looking in the EDC system and verifying that information for that data point. It can be a very quick conversation. It can be over and done with in 30 seconds, but we want to make sure that we're focusing on what is essential or critical in order to move forward with locking that database. And there are plenty of other questions, I think, around database that Jackie will cover in just a minute, around some of the considerations that you need to take from that perspective. I think then once you've gone through that assessment and that analysis and you know what % of data is unmonitored, you know what percentage of data is at risk, so what % of critical data is included in that data set that's been unmonitored, and bring in your statisticians to say, how significant is this missed data to our analysis? If it's 1 or 2 endpoints that might or might not be accurate, how confident are we can go ahead and move forward with locking the database? So those are the things I think that we need to really consider in this time period. Again, keeping in mind those principles of making sure that we're assessing the burden that we might be placing inadvertently on site. So I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jackie Hughes, to talk about the implications for our EDC process and workflows.
Thank you, Nicole. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So yes, considerations regarding a change to the monitoring strategy. Within the EDC system, you may have defined which data you're going to SDV as you've built the database, and you've tagged the data within the system that you need to have that data SDV before you can lock the database. You may have also have developed a targeted SDV plan with tiers of which patients visits and the level of SDV that you're planning on doing for the study. And according to that within the system, you will have established reports, status reports, to be able to provide information as to how much percentage of SDV has been undertaken, what's outstanding, etc., according to that plan that you've established and the expectations of marking that within the system once the SDV has been completed. So as you've heard from Nicole, due to COVID-19, we're having to look at a different approach to monitoring, and there will be data that we are unable to SDV. And you'll need to make that assessment of the impact of that on how to handle that in the EDC system. And this is really quite system dependent. It may be you have to disable the module that you originally established as what the targeted SDV plan was. You may need to migrate the database, take the database down to take off the expected SDV. But as Nicole said, taking a pragmatic approach, you need to assess the impact, not necessarily take the system down, but if you cannot do the SDV that you originally planned, you're going to need to document that and pull reports from the system and be able to then review that information, as Nicole said, with the cross-functional team of what data you originally had planned to SDV and how critical that is to any formal interim or final locks that you may be coming up against. And another thing you need to consider in the SDV, if you have established a workflow in your core configuration where you have various activities that you've got within the system and expectation that you mark those activities when they're complete in the EDC system. So, for example, a workflow where you are tagging that you've completed the SDV, that you've expected to do on the critical data. You have done data entry lock, you tag that, DM quality review, PI signatures complete, and then you can move to a system lock and extract the data for analysis. You can set preconditions in your core configuration workflow, and that precondition means that you cannot move to the next activity and complete that activity within the system. So you're going to need to review your core configuration, and if you have established a precondition against your SDV, so that you cannot progress downstream with the other activities and mark them in the system as complete. For example, if you can't do that SDV against some data, if you have a precondition that has to be in the system before you can get PI signature and before you can lock the database, you're going to need to have to look at removing those preconditions if you believe you're not going to be able to SDV that data prior to an interim or a final lock. Nicole's talked about some of the database lock requirements and rules, and our standard process, of course, we're trying to ensure we have all the data monitored and SDV'd. We expect all the data, no missing data, no unresolved queries, etc. We do a raft of checks that we've got the medical review undertaken, etc., before we move to an interim or a final lock. That definition of clean, you're going to need to relook at that and make that assessment as to whether your database, you can declare that clean and fit for the analysis and the downstream reporting. And that's going to need that cross-functional review of the medics, the clinical team, data management and statisticians, again, to look at the protocol deviations that are related to COVID-19, the SDV that's monitored, as Nicole said, how critical is that for the analysis? And you need to have a look at all the missing data, because you can expect there will be more gaps in the data, more unresolved queries. You're going to have missing variables, missing visits, missing pages related to the challenges of collection of that data due to COVID-19. So you're going to need to take that thorough assessment and potentially defer your lock if you feel some of that data is critical and it's going to impact the analysis. Next slide, please. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Jackie. So the next question is, what should we do after the COVID-19 situation starts to resolve? Well, ACRO's position is that it is not going to be necessary at this point to perform 100% SDR and SDV of all subject visits and data that we didn't do during this, before this pandemic period started. When routine monitoring resumes, a risk-based approach to monitoring subjects should be used. And this may include strategies like performing 100% SDR and SDV of any screening or baseline visits that occurred during this time period so that we can confirm consent and eligibility. It may also include something like a sampling of other visits. So for example, only performing 100% SDR and SDV of a percentage of subjects or select critical subject visits, like visits where dose titration occurred, visits where SAEs were reported, early termination visits, or perhaps visits that were disrupted because of COVID-19. So for example, if I'm a CRA and on March 1st, I had 18 subject visits that I was waiting to get out to the site to monitor. And this was before the pandemic period. So those 18 visits were performed just like they normally would. There were no disruptions going on. Everything was great, but I wasn't able to get out there and monitor those 18 subject visits. However, on March 2nd, the quarantine came into effect and I'm not able to go out there and monitor those subjects. The site has since been able to bring in 10 more subjects and have 10 more subject visits. But those visits may have been disrupted due to the pandemic in some way, shape, or form. Either those visits were conducted partially via telehealth. They were late, perhaps. They maybe some of the procedures were not able to be performed. The labs weren't drawn using the study lab kit. They were sent to a local lab for assessment of some of those, or some of the visits may have been skipped altogether. So because of that, I'm now, let's fast forward to, let's say, let's be hopeful and think May of this year, and the site's back up and running, and I'm as a CRA now able to go back out to the site. I now have double the amount of data to review perhaps in this time period than I needed to. And I normally would only stay one day on site. Well, now what we don't want to have happen is this giant bottleneck on sites who are recovering from COVID themselves, to have every CRO for every sponsor and every protocol going out on site and saying, well, in order for me to catch up on my backlog now, I am going to either send 2 people or 3 people or 4 people to go out to your site to monitor that data, or I'm going to be there for 5 days instead of 1 day to catch up. If every one of us, CROs and sponsors, decided that we're going to go back and do 100% SDR and SDV of everything when we're in the recovery period, we will again overwhelm the sites. And I think we need to make sure that we're really focusing on what is critical at that point in time. So using some of these approaches, focusing on those visits that for eligibility, focusing on critical subject visits, not doing 100% of everything that was in those 18 backlog, only looking at those visits that were critical for certain subjects, and then focusing 100% SDR and SDV on these visits that happened during this pandemic time period that were disrupted, where the regulatory authorities have said, we know there's going to be a lot more deviations, and we're going to need to spend a lot more time capturing and detailing those deviations so that those can be reported appropriately to IRBs and ethics committees and we know the impact that this, we can calculate the impact that this pandemic had on the execution of the trial. That's where we need to make sure that we're focusing our time and attention when we're moving into that recovery period. And now we'll move on to some questions. So do we have some questions?
Yes, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Now I would like to invite our audience members to continue sending in their questions using the questions window for the Q&A portion of this webinar. So I've received some of those already. I'll start with those. Our first question here is, if sites are unable to complete subject visits due to the restrictions on travel or health risks, is remote monitoring still necessary?
The answer to that question, I think, is yes. We know that there could be data in backlog that we weren't able to get out on site and monitor. So I think that even though their current visits have been interrupted, we definitely need to make sure that we're still monitoring the data that was collected prior to this pandemic period. There could be patient safety issues sitting in that data that no one has realized, and we want to make sure that we're assessing that. So an abnormal lab value or something that should have been addressed from that standpoint, I think we definitely want to still be looking at that data, even if we're looking at only the data that's been collected in EDC. And then I think even if patient visits have not been able to happen the way that they should, I think still performing the contact with the sites to find out what the status is. It seems like every week things are changing, where a week ago when we would talk to a number of our sites, they were still able to see patients. If we called them this week, that situation may be very different. And so maintaining some of those monitoring visits to be able to document which patients are still being able to be seen, which visits are being skipped, and documenting what those sites' flexible recovery plans themselves are. Some sites may be using their own internal telehealth systems, and we want to make sure that we're documenting, okay, this week they've decided to start using telehealth to do X, Y, and Z, and reporting that back into the project team and the sponsor, so that not only we can share that information across the team, but also perhaps help the next site who's about to be hit with the same challenges, and share with that site on how other sites are alleviating that situation. So definitely still a lot of value in continuing those activities. Next question.
Thank you very much. So our next question is, if sites are unable to maintain data entry during this time due to completing priorities, how can remote monitoring be useful?
That is definitely a challenge. The sites being unable to enter the data, even if it's being collected. And we recognize that may be a problem in some locations. I think, again, being able to understand what that backlog is so that we can be prepared to assess the sites again in that recovery time period. So that's one thing of just making sure that we know the volume of what is occurring but isn't able to be entered. And sometimes that's just making sure that we're documenting those discussions with the site, sharing that information with data management and other staff so that we know what the potential volume is going to be when we move into that recovery mode. I think another thing that we could look at would be in those areas where there is the possibility of looking at data in the EHR and having access to EHR. And again, I'm reiterating, where that access already exists and is available and is allowed, being able to go in and look at that data in the EHR even before it's been entered into EDC can be of some value. And then I think the other thing is just tallying that information for the sponsor to be able to say, look, we know that these sites are going to have a significant amount of data backlog when they are able to get back into their facility and begin the data entry process. How can we help support them? So it may be that we do some unprecedented things like send some people to help these sites enter data. We have done that before in some extreme circumstances. It's certainly not a regular practice, but difficult times, I think, sometimes result in new innovative ways that we can think of to help support. But being able to start planning some of those kinds of things now, and being able to measure the scale and the scope that those potential changes might have are going to help us as we start to move into that recovery mode.
Thank you. Our next question is, how should changes to monitoring strategy be documented?
I think there's a couple of different ways that those changes can be documented. One of the ways is, and I think every company is going to have their different strategies and methodologies. We can do things like a planned deviation to our procedural documents, where we say that where we normally would, where a company might normally require 100% SDR and SDV, to be able to do a planned deviation to say, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, less than 100% SDR and SDV may be used during the COVID period and the recovery period beyond. There could be, I think the best way to probably do it would be to go into the, do an addendum to your central or your clinical monitoring plan. Would be my recommendation for CROs, to be able to say, effective on this date, these are some of the altered monitoring strategies that can be used. And I think you need to be really flexible in those, because every site might be a little different. Some sites might, be still functioning fairly well. Other sites, that solution might end up looking a little different. So an addendum to the CMP that is flexible, but I think it's important to show how you did it and document how you did different things with different sites in your site monitoring records are going to be really important. So the IMV or remote IMV documentation should be really clear in what you looked at and how you looked at it, and even what you weren't able to look at.
Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question here is, how is DM or BIOS preparing for evaluating the impact of missed data?
Okay, I'll take this one, Nicole. So how is DM and biostats preparing for evaluating the impact of missing data? So as we commented earlier, we are going to get more missing data, missing visits, missing fields, missing pages, and we're going to get more protocol deviations related to COVID-19. So we do need a process, need to work very closely with stats. How are we going to provide that information to the biostats team? DM has to have a process in place. We really should be capturing within the system that any data that's missing, it is related to COVID-19. So there's a number of ways we can do that. We can update the database and capture from drop-down boxes that any missing data is due to that, and ask the sites to do that. But following our guiding principles, we need to be as pragmatic as possible when capturing information on why we've got missing data. So wherever possible, follow the current processes and use the process such as raising the queries and asking the sites. If data is missing, we'll trigger the query anyway as missing data, but they will refer that it's due to COVID-19. And we'll be able to pull that information from the database. We'll be able to search on that and pull that and provide reports to the stats team so that they can see the information that's missing. And we recommend ongoing review and analysis of that accumulating data, that accumulating information of what data is missing, so that the stats team can start to evaluate the impact of COVID, the loss of subjects, the missing data, and the ability to interpret treatment effects, etc. So close, regular output of data as we are seeing building the database and finding those gaps in that data. It's going to be important to provide that information, and then stats need to obviously assess as they're seeing the gaps in the data what impact that's going to have on the analysis and updates to the SAP.
Thank you. Our next question here is, are there ethical implications on sending source data with subjects' personal information and anonymized for remote review?
So I would say transmitting that information by scan or fax, or downloading it and putting it in a Dropbox or some other place, I would highly recommend against doing anything like that at this point. That is not what we're talking about doing. We don't want to transfer any of that. But you have to remember that when the CRAs go on site during an on-site visit, they have access to the identifying information of patients when they're reviewing those charts, those medical records, etc. They're there, they're looking at it, they're seeing it. And that's great. They've got that ability to do that, to verify the patient, the consent information, all of those kinds of things. What we don't want to happen is that transmission of that personalized data in any way. So if that's why we're saying, if the CRA already has access where they can log in remotely to the site's EHR and see that data, then they can do that. But what we don't want to do is any kind of attempt for heroic measures to get access to that patient data, because we do start to blur those lines of what we really should be doing, and we don't want to do that. Plus, it would add significant burden to the site. So again, you know, our point really is, look at the data that we've got available to us in EDC. We're already looking at that data. There's no, it's all anonymized information. There's no subject identifiers in that EDC data. And there's still a lot of information we can glean about the study conduct, patient safety, all of those kinds of things. I actually have a couple of questions that I've gotten, and I'd like to go through those if you don't mind, and highlight a few of those. There was a question that we have around consent, and whether or not we need to consider anything about subjects' consent for review of this information remotely. So I would say that in the consent forms, they already allow for patient data to be reviewed by affiliates of the sponsor company and those kinds of things. And as long as we stick with that basic principle, I don't think we need to worry about it until we start talking about, again, that transmission of those EHRs, because that's not what those subjects consented to. They did not consent that their records were going to be scanned and sent somewhere with their identifying information, or even their identifying information blinded. So we need to make sure that those activities are not happening. However, we need to think any review that we're doing of the data in EDC without the source documentation, we do already, and that should be covered as part of that information in the consent. As soon as patients' data is entered into EDC in a normal way, we're all centrally looking at that data, the query process starts, et cetera, et cetera. So from a consent standpoint, I think where we start to be concerned about that is that transmission of patient data in a way that was not anticipated in the trial if it has personal identifiers, and that's where I would be cautious. Another question that I had was, if we're unable to verify eligibility for newly enrolled patients, should we stop enrollment? And I think the guidance from the regulators, both FDA and MHRA, have indicated that you really do need to do a very thorough risk assessment in this case, and determine that on a case-by-case basis. And that is a decision that needs to be made. If this is a trial that puts the patients at significant risk, if we don't enroll them into the trial, like this is their only option in a chemotherapy trial, it may be worth it to continue. But I think in a case where there could be mistakes in eligibility, this is not a critical study or indication for a patient, or it's not a treatment that is required necessarily for a patient, it may be best to stop enrollment and decide to enroll at a later time. And I think every one of these considerations need to be made on a case-by-case basis, really taking the time to think through. You know, with all of the transmission rates of COVID and the chances that your trial could be impacted because your patient contracts COVID in the middle of the study or shortly after enrollment, is that going to jeopardize your data? Is that going to make it harder to analyze the data and assess your endpoints? And if the answer to that is yes, then maybe it is prudent to stop enrollment so that you don't, you know, compound the issues and introduce other variables into that data that we weren't planning when we started. So I think it's a case-by-case basis there, and something that really needs to be carefully assessed. The other question that I had is around, is it okay to monitor, to perform monitoring using Zoom or Facetime or something along those lines? I really think that is starting to stretch the envelope in a couple of ways. Number one, if you were already doing Zoom or WebEx or FaceTime meetings between a CRA and a study coordinator, those I think are fine to continue. What we don't want to have happen is that you expect that study coordinator to video the office or facilities during that WebEx meeting if you weren't already doing that, or video medical records of a patient in that manner if you weren't already doing it, and certainly not in a capacity using a service like FaceTime or Zoom that may not have all of the regulatory and data storage considerations accessed. I mean, what I mean by that is when you record something on FaceTime, where is that recording stored? Who has access to that recording? If you don't know the answer to those questions, it is probably not best to perform that recording of data or something in that way, because we don't know where that is stored. And that could end up later violating the privacy of a patient in a way that we didn't expect. So that would be my advice there, is to not go down that route with using video to review data or to see something you normally would not see unless we absolutely know that the platform that is being used and you know where that data is being stored and the security of that, and guarantee the protection of that patient's safety. And I know that is at the end of our hour, and I just want to say one more thing. I know this has been a very stressful time for every one of us, not only personally, but professionally, as we try to navigate this. We are all committed to keeping clinical trials moving for the patients who need these therapies and medications, and we are committed to doing this. But we have to be pragmatic in our approach. We cannot overburden these sites and healthcare personnel at this stage, and we need to be very careful about that. I think the other thing that we need to do is we need to think about this and not get overwhelmed by the volume of what we're seeing. But in almost every single case that has come up where someone's asked a question, can we do this? Or what happens if we can't get the PI to sign? We know how to handle these things. There's probably not a single item in and of itself that has not happened at least once in a clinical trial before that we've solved. We've put our heads together, we've come up with a way to handle it, and we've solved it. Now, granted, those have been on a case-by-case basis and not anywhere near the volume or the everything happening at one time. But we all need to make sure that we're thinking things through the way that we have in the past, and really try to make sure that we're taking that pragmatic approach. So thank you all for your time today, and I'd like to thank my colleague Jackie as well for being such a great partner throughout this process.
Well, thank you very much for those answers. We've reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. Thank you everyone for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us improve our webinars. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Nicole Stansberry and Jackie Hughes, and feel free to share the recorded version of this webinar using the link in the chat box when it becomes available. We hope you found this conference informative. Have a good day, everyone.